put it face. Just put it face up.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Are there any more quizzes? Bring them down. Put it down. And time is up. Time is up. Good. Can't take an extra 2 minutes. It's not right. Okay, folks. Yeah, you can come in, yeah. Thank you. You can come in. Okay. So let's wait for the people to come in. Okay, so the usual rules apply with a twist. My general rule is I try to return quizzes within 24 hours just to get them out of my office. It's not for you. I don't like them in my office. This time I have a problem. I have to leave at 7 p.m. tonight to go to London. The quizzes will be graded by tomorrow morning. And if you want to pick them up, you got to fly to London. So I'll be back on Saturday and I'll bring the quizzes back. I will not put up the solutions until Saturday for a simple reason. You will look at the solutions and you will freak out. And I don't want that to happen. Right? But there's one problem on this quiz that actually I'm very fond of, because I thought it was very simple as I wrote it, but the layers to it, I think, cut to the heart of what's happening around us. My wife and I are creatures of habit. You know, we go to a movie every week. Surprises are vastly overrated. Maybe when you're dating, but after 32 years of marriage, there's no more surprises. We just know. We go to a movie every week, and about 8 months ago, we decided to get the AMC movie plan. Anybody here have the AMC monthly movie plan? Hey? You have it? How many movies do you used to go to before the plan? Just give me a rough estimate. I'm not probing too deeply. 2 or 3 a month. Right? And you used to pay in New York City? Right? Cost you what, $15 a piece now? I haven't gone to a movie in New York. So you used to spend about $30 a month. The AMC movie plan is, I think, $23 or $24. So let's assume I am a movie theater company. I own 5 movie theaters in a town, and I'm the only game in town. And I have 10,000 people who come to the movies, and on average they come once a week. So I get 4 movies a week, 10,000 subscribers, or 10,000 moviegoers. And I decide to offer, so right now I'm making $40 per customer every month on average, and I offer them a movie plan at $25 a month. If you're the capital budgeting analyst looking at this plan, what would your revenues be from just what you collect from the moviegoers for going to the movies? You used to collect what, $40 a month? You're now going to collect $25. Your incremental revenues from the subscription plan will actually be minus 15 times. Now do you see why it's going to be really difficult to get subscription plans to actually pay off? If all your subscribers actually are existing moviegoers, you are completely and totally screwed because your incremental revenues are negative. So for a subscription plan to work, what has to happen? I either have to get new subscribers, that's one. The other is buying concessions. I thought about throwing concessions in, but I said, this is complicated enough, I will not throw that in. But you could actually make this an entire case study, really. I thought about actually making this a case study because on those 10,000 subscribers, you should have actually put in minus $15 a month or minus $180 a year. Instead, you put in $25. You actually have overestimated your revenues by $40 a subscriber. Those $40 you collected are now going to be gone. So you actually will end up flipping the net present value on this project once you bring in the lost revenues. To show you how layered this is, the first time I solved it, I was sloppy. I just took the incremental revenue, took the present value of it. So if you did that, I'm going to cut you a lot of slack because when I did it the first time, that's what I did and said, that's not right. I'm actually going to lose $40 every month from these subscribers. So you take the present value of $480 times 10,000 or whatever your number was, depending on the quiz you got, and you take it for a year and you take the present value of those savings, it's a huge loss. So here's the consolation prize, even if you got the quiz problem wrong. It's a very small consolation prize. The next time you read about a subscription plan and people getting excited about it, people are excited about the AMC plan. It signed up 2.5 million people already. And people are actually pushing up AMC's stock price because they look at because what the analysts look at is 2.5 million people look at how much revenue AMC is collecting. I'd be interested to see what the total revenues for AMC look like next year. I wouldn't be surprised if with this incredibly successful subscription plan, their total revenues actually decreased unless they get massive, and here's why being creatures of habit is going to ruin AMC. We have never ever bought popcorn. This is crappy popcorn and horrific soda, so they're not getting a single cent out of us. Yeah. That's true, but that's exactly what you're hoping for, and the interesting question is, will that pay off? Because that's an untested proposition, and that's why looking at the total revenues is going to... So the next time you see a company switching to a subscription plan and they're boasting about the number of subscribers they're signing up, don't get too excited yet until you look at the total revenues of the company next year, because for this plan to work, you actually have to attract new subscribers, or you've got to get side benefits that make up for the fact that on the subscription plan, you're losing too much money. There's a reason Lyft actually abandoned, they tried a subscription plan in San Jose because they were concerned about, they wanted the model to be more sticky. They very quickly abandoned it because the subscription plan was $30 a month or $35 a month or something like that, some small amount. And they discovered the people who are switching to the subscription plan used to be the $250, $300 Lyft customers. And there was no way, because it's not like they're selling you food while that's actually not a bad idea for ride sharing, right? Here's a breakfast. Do you want it $8? I mean, United, we pay all those exorbitant prices when we're up there. Maybe they have you trapped in a car and they can sell you other stuff. But if you can't sell other stuff, it becomes really tough for subscription plans. But right now, subscription plans are hot. You know why? Because they come with numbers of subscribers. And I think we're overreacting to those numbers and making them more successful than they actually are. The other two problems had little twists in them. I actually, in the first problem, the tax rate I set for the two countries the same. And you have a Mexican project. I said the Mexican. What if the tax rate in Mexico was 0% and the tax rate in the US were 25%? When you did the after-tax cost of debt for this project, would you use 25% as your tax rate or 0% as your tax rate? You said 0%? Everybody agree that you'd get a use of 0%? Do you decide what? Yeah, you had a different answer, somebody? You meant 25%? Okay, that's a very, this is actually a discrete choice, 0 or 25. Okay, then you use the 25% because borrowing is a choice, right? And you as the CFO decide where to borrow money. You're not automatically locked in, but you're saying, but then I'll be mismatching my debt, right? Can you have your cake and eat it too? Can you borrow your money in the US and get rid of the mismatch? You borrow the money in the US in US dollars. You can swap, you can have derivatives, you can actually get rid of the mismatch and get your tax benefit. And that's exactly what US companies used to do when the tax rate was 40%, is they'd focus all their borrowing in the US because you got a 40% tax benefit, and then try to fix the mismatch, if they were careful, by using futures and forwards and options. And that's the advantage the derivatives market has given us, is you can then get the tax benefit from debt and not have the mismatch of currencies. Okay? But don't worry, I didn't throw that in the quiz. I just let you use the 25% tax rate because the only tax rate you could use. Okay? And on the first quiz, the first problem, it's basically keeping your focus on the fact that there's a project and everything you do for the discount rate should be about the project. The project is a movie project. Your beta should be a movie beta. I did allow you, the problem did specify you can get away using the debt to equity ratio of the movie business. That too could have been grayer, right? I could have given you a company mix and then left things murky, but I wanted that not to be an issue. So the cost of debt, the debt ratio are essentially going to be reflective of the movie project, and the cost of equity would reflect the risk of the movie business. Not really, because if you're again, this is a question of choice. You are a US borrower. Let's say Mexican banks charge a spread because you're in Mexico. Yeah. No, I'm saying even if it's included. Let's say I gave you a default spread in Mexico is 5%, the default spread in the US is 2.5%. The logic you just used for why you use the 25% tax rate would kick in there as well, right? And the risk of the project doesn't have any, so in a sense, the reason you charge a higher default spread as a Mexican company is you're tarred by the fact that you're a Mexican company. It's nothing to do with the risk of the project that's driving it. It's the fact that your country of incorporation is Mexico. And for better or worse, it might not be the fairest thing to do, but right now, because you're a Mexican company, it actually gives a US company an advantage when it competes against a Mexican company, even for a domestic Mexican project, because the US company can borrow money in the US without having, you're right, it does seem like a violation, but it reflects the reality out there, which is your country of incorporation still seems to matter.
Sometimes you give the dollar bond spread between Mexico and US.
Yeah.
You used to add it. That information was missing.
Yeah. And also you would do that if you wanted to get a country risk premium. So in a sense, I gave you the equity risk premium for the country, and I essentially kind of wanted you to kind of stay away from those issues because the first quiz should have covered those. Even if you didn't get that problem in the first quiz, it covered those. So let's set that behind us and let's get back to this trade-off. It's good that we talked about taxes and debt because I gave you the trade-off on debt. The two biggest benefits of debt are, you remember? What's the biggest benefit? That should be the tax benefit, right? So if I make your tax rate 0, already I've taken away your biggest and only reason often for borrowing money. Your second benefit is, do you remember? Anybody? Accountability, added discipline, right? Managers who are sloppy and lazy, you go out and borrow money. It might make them a little more disciplined. And on the other side, what's the biggest cost of borrowing money? What's the biggest danger? Interest rate is a given, right? You always have to pay it. It is. You could go bankrupt. You worry about default risk and truncation risk, putting your promising future at risk. The second is an agency cost, which is the fact that what's good for equity investors and what's good for lenders don't converge. And because they don't converge, the lenders load up stuff on you as an equity investor. Covenants, restrictions, monitors, lawyers. If you don't want that, don't borrow money. And finally, there's this flexibility. The more you value flexibility as a company, the less you borrow. So when people start to wring their hands about why tech companies don't borrow too much money, I'm surprised, because you take it through the trade-off, you can see exactly why a tech company will borrow a lot less money, even if it's a mature company, than a manufacturing company you're hurting. But I left you with a Twilight Zone scenario. Remember what it was? You live in a world with no taxes. What the hell is that? Okay. More construction. You know, this building was built in '92. There hasn't been a single day in the last 27 years where there hasn't been construction in this building. So when the next time they ask you for money, have they been asking you for money at Stern? Put a condition on it. As long as it doesn't go into construction, you'll give the money. I'm going to get into trouble for saying that, but that's okay. Okay? So you live in a world with no taxes. Managers do what's right for stockholders. They pick good projects and reject bad projects. No firm goes bankrupt. Equity investors don't lie. They tell you exactly what they're going to do with the money. And firms know their future financing needs with certainty. Let's look at the trade-off. Let's go item by item. In this world, what are the tax benefits? 0. What about added discipline? Managers already do the right thing. Why do you need discipline? 0. Expected bankruptcy costs? Nobody goes bankrupt. 0. Agency cost? 0. If you don't lie, then where's the agency problem? And who needs future flexibility when you know your financing needs with certainty? 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. I think you add up as many zeros as you want, you still end up with 0. So debt has no benefits and no costs. So how much money should you borrow? It doesn't matter. You borrow $10, $100, $100 million, that has no benefits, no costs. You've just uncovered corporate finance's most famous theorem. Start of this class, I told you corporate finance is probably 62 years old. It can be traced back to a paper written in 1958 by Miller and Modigliani. And that paper essentially laid out the argument that debt doesn't matter, but it made it under these very specific conditions. In a world with no taxes, no default risk, and no agency costs, it doesn't matter how much you borrow. You can't make a business more valuable by just borrowing money, because you're just changing the mix of debt and equity. And in fact, the analogy that Merton Miller used, he's a great teacher, is when he won the Nobel Prize. You know how journalists ask, can you synthesize your life's work into like 2 minutes in a catchy phrase if you can? And most Nobel Prize winners, 2 minutes is just getting heated up. Merton Miller brought out a bottle of milk. And he said, think about the calories in a bottle of milk. Think of it as full fat milk. And then think of taking the milk and making it into butter and fat-free milk, and think about what the calories are. You don't change the calories by just shifting the mix of milk. He said the same thing with a business. You have a great business, you have a great business. Changing the mix is not going to do it. So the only way debt can affect your value is if something outside impedes in the process. Like what? Tax benefits and default risk. One of the great tragedies of the Miller Modigliani theorem is the only thing most people remember about their capital structure classes is the Miller Modigliani theorem. And how convenient. I don't remember any of that debt discussion, but it doesn't matter anyway. You'd be amazed at how many investment bankers use Miller Modigliani, like garlic with a vampire. Whenever you talk about it, Miller Modigliani, back off, right? Because they don't want to talk about debt. To show you how absurd that standing is. One of my first classes, 1986, was the first year I taught corporate finance here. Somebody went through that class, landed a job at a private equity fund, an LBO fund as they were called then. And he was involved in the Bloomingdale's LBO, one of the very first LBOs, okay, where a Canadian lunatic named Robert Campo, he was actually certifiably insane. But he was really wealthy, and when you're wealthy and insane, bankers seem to have no trouble doing deals with you. They took Bloomingdale's into a leverage buyout, and the deal just blew up. Took down this private equity fund, went bankrupt. This guy lost his job, landed on his feet, and got a job somewhere else. And 6 or 7 years later, ran into him somewhere on Wall Street. And I asked him what he'd been doing, and he said he worked at this LBO fund that was involved in the Bloomingdale's LBO. And I said, I never understood that leverage buyout. I mean, you take a high-end department store with cyclical revenues. Why would you load them up with 90% debt? It seemed like too much debt. And he said, don't you remember the Miller Modigliani theorem? I said, I do. And I'm glad you live in a world with no taxes and no default risk. But remind me again what happened to that outfit you used to work for? And without a trace of irony, he said, it went bankrupt. You see the irony here? You're talking about the Miller Modigliani theorem, which assumes what? That nobody ever goes bankrupt. In the same statement, you talk about them going bankrupt. So let's be very clear. I don't know the world you live in, but the world I live in, tax day is coming. I can't tell the IRS, look, I'm in a Twilight Zone episode right now where there are no taxes. I've chosen not to file taxes. It's not going to fly very far. I live in a world with taxes, and I see default risk all around me. But in a world with no taxes, no default risk, and no agency costs, it is true, debt cannot create value. In fact, if you lived in the Miller Modigliani world, life becomes very simple. You can value your company as an unlevered company with all equity, and the value is going to be the same if you load up with 10 billion, 5 billion, 15 billion of debt, because all that will happen is your cost of capital will remain the same, because whatever you think you're gaining by replacing more expensive equity with cheaper debt will be offset by the changes in the two. Your cost of capital will reflect the risk of the businesses you're in, and you're done. You can just take the unlevered beta, come up with the cost of equity, and that cost of equity will be the cost of capital at every debt ratio. So in a world with taxes, default risk, and agency costs, it does matter how much you borrow. So I'm going to take a little diversion here. We've talked about the trade-off on debt and equity. I want to now take a diversion and look at what companies, if companies were allowed to pick where they could raise their financing, I want to see what they would like to use the most in terms of the hierarchy. What's their most preferred way of raising money? And then work down the list. And before I show you the list, I'm going to list out two things that I think managers value a great deal. The first is managers value flexibility. They value a source of financing where they can go when they want to and essentially not go when they don't want to, where they're not locked in. They value the flexibility. And secondly, they value control. Any source of financing where people are going to ask them questions and want to look at their numbers, are less attractive than source of financing where they don't have to. You value control and you value flexibility. You're a company and you want to raise money for projects. What is your absolutely perfect way of raising money? A way of raising money where you never have to answer explicit questions about showing your numbers and doing the insights. What is your perfect way of raising money? What is it? I can't hear. But if you have to issue shares, you have to issue a prospectus and then you have to show your numbers. But you're right, issuing equity, what's the most common way in which companies raise equity for projects? They don't have to issue shares. What do they do? You're going too far away from equity because bonds will definitely take you off the equity stream. It's retained earnings, right? You take net income, you put it back in the company. It is equity. And it's equity that you don't have to answer to. It's not like the equity investors demand to know what the projects are. They can, but you can refuse to tell them. You get complete control and complete flexibility. So guess what? Number one source of financing. If you ask CFOs, what's your best way? So I'm not saying these are the right ways of raising financing. This is the number one. And if you look at companies, that's where them. So if you look at Microsoft, you know Microsoft went public in 1986. It's never issued new shares since. Why? Because by the time it went public, it was actually slightly cash flow positive. And when it needed money for projects, what did it do? It took money that it was making from its Windows at that point in time. It wasn't even Windows, MS-DOS, and put it back into the company. You look at almost every large company in the US, once they go public, most of them, at least the companies from the last century, never went back to the market to raise more equity. But their equity grew because they had retained earnings going back. The companies of this last decade, things might be different. Lyft will definitely have to come back to the market. You know why? Because for its growth, it's a negative cash flow company, and it can't borrow money. But the companies of the last century retained earnings. So retain earnings, number one. Number two on the list is straight debt. I'm not talking about the sexual orientation of debt here when I talk about straight debt. Straight debt is fixed rate, bank loan, where you don't have conversion features and all the stuff the bankers try to add on. If you have a choice, you want to keep your debt simple. You know exactly what your payments are going to be. There are no contingencies, options. Second choice is straight debt. Third is convertible debt. A little messier than straight debt because you now have to add a conversion option to the debt, which can be out of your control. It can create new shares outstanding. Fourth on the list is new shares. Companies would much rather raise money from debt issues than equity issues. And then you get preferred stock, where you get all of the disadvantages of debt and none of the advantages. All of the disadvantages because you pay a fixed dividend. I'm talking about the US version of preferred stock, but it's not tax deductible. And then if you get really, really desperate, you got convertible preferred stock. I'm going to run a little experiment on you. Let's suppose you open up the Wall Street Journal tomorrow, and you know what a tombstone ad is? Tombstone ad, a company announced it's going to raise money. So you'll say tombstone ad. So such and such company plans to raise $15 million through the issue of. You open up, there's a tombstone ad for a company you'd never heard of. You have no idea what it does. But it tells you that it's trying to raise $15 million from convertible preferred stock. And I ask you to guess what the financial standing of this company is. What would your guess be? It's a really strong, healthy company? I mean, if it's issuing convertible, you're at the bottom of the barrel. Why would you go there? Because nothing else works for you. When you see convertible preferred stock in a company, it's a sign that they were really desperate. There's a reason young growth companies often raise convertible preferred. Nothing else works. So actually looking at what companies issue, you can actually get a sense of, are these companies healthy companies, trouble companies, negative cash flow companies? Because the hierarchy is actually remarkably stable around the world. You go, I've seen these hierarchies in Europe. They've asked European CFOs, same kind of ranking that you get. So when you look at the consequences, you can see that the bulk of funding for companies comes from internal equity. Internal equity is retained earnings. Second is debt, and it's only when you need the extra money that you go for common stock issues. And often those common stock issues come from very young companies in the market or IPOs. So when you look at financing choices, just looking at what companies issue, I think is a very good indication. So if you see a strong company, I would expect to see bond issues. If they need to raise money, just a classic bond. When I see all kinds of stuff loaded on the bond, that to me is not a good sign of the health of the company, because those special features make the bond more unpredictable. But maybe that's the only way you can get people to buy your bonds. Any questions on this? Is called the financing hierarchy. It basically is a reflection of what companies choose, but you can read from the hierarchy what they value. So now let's talk about the right mix of debt and equity. We've laid the foundations. Let's talk about tools we can use to decide what the right mix of debt and equity is. Okay. I'm going to go through 5 different approaches. The 5th one I've actually already gone through. 5 different ways in which you can come up with an optimal debt ratio for your company. The first is that Swiss Army knife that we've been using so far, the cost of capital. Think of how we've already used it as a hurdle rate for projects. It's going to now become an optimizing tool. I'm going to argue that by looking at the cost of capital at different debt ratios, you can tell me what the right mix of debt and equity for your company is. Next, I'm going to talk about taking the cost of capital approach. And the cost of capital approach actually is an approach that makes some very strong assumptions that might or might not hold, and relaxing those assumptions. Assumptions like what? Assumptions like the cost of debt reflects your distress risk, that you're really bringing in the distress through the cost of debt. That the unlevered beta of debt is zero, therefore I can load everything into the equity. So I'm going to give you ways of bringing in some enhancement to the cost of capital. The next approach I'm going to talk about is called the adjusted present value approach. This is an approach that the University of Chicago developed about 30 years ago. And if you've been going through the MBA program at the University of Chicago, this would be religion, that the only way to get the optimal debt ratio is to use this APV approach. I'm going to argue that most people who use the APV approach are using a half-assed version of it that leads them to nowhere, and I'll talk about why. And I'm going to argue there's a way in which you can use the APV approach that brings in the cost, and if you do, your answer is not going to be that different from mine, or the cost of capital approach. And then I'm going to talk about the way most companies pick debt ratios. In my view, you know how most companies pick debt ratios? What do? I'm sorry? They just look at everybody else in the sector and they say, hey, everybody else is at 30%, I'm going to be at 30%. And I'm going to argue that that's not irrational. And I'm going to talk about why companies adopt this Me Too approach to capital structure, right? Because that's all it is. Why do you borrow 40%? Well, because everybody else, me too. It's a very dangerous way to run a business, but you'll see the allure of staying close to what everybody else does. So let's start with the cost of capital approach. When we talked about the cost of capital, we talked about it as a hurdle rate, what we need to beat on a project, right? So in the quiz, the cost of capital on problem 1 was that's going to be the hurdle rate to decide whether to take that project in Mexico. But the cost of capital actually comes into play later when we talk about the value of a company. Just as the net present value of a project is computed by taking the cash flows and discounting back the cost of capital, if you ask me to value an entire company, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to treat it like a project, come up with the cash flows of the entire company over time, and take the present value of those cash flows at the cost of capital, and what I get as a present value will be the value of the company. So let's play a little game. Let's assume you're trying to value a firm. You projected out the cash flows. Remember, the cash flows you discount when you use the cost of capital are pre-debt cash flows. Right? So before interest payments, so you project the cash flows out. And you discount them at the cost of capital. Here's my simple question. If you hold the cash flows fixed and lower your cost of capital, what's going to happen to your value? It's going to go up. It's obvious because lower discount rate, same cash flows. And if at the limit I minimize my cost of capital, what have I done to my value? I've maximized my value. You think, who cares? What's the objective in corporate finance? I know that picture was just a few pages ago, but I didn't focus on it. It is to maximize the value of the business. So if I take that mission seriously, I want to find a debt ratio that minimizes my cost of capital. So if I can find the mix of debt and equity that minimizes my cost of capital, I've essentially found the optimal debt ratio for a company. Now, some people take this very, very literally. So they say, okay, all I need to do is change the debt ratios and see which debt ratio leads me to the lower cost of capital. But if you do that, leaving the cost of equity and the cost of debt fixed, I'll safely predict that you're going to end up with a 100% debt ratio. Why? Because the cost of debt is lower than the cost of equity. So all you do is change the mix, and you leave the two numbers. So something's got to change, right? In fact, here's what's going to happen. As I change my debt ratio, the whole process goes into motion. In what sense? My cost of equity comes from a beta. My beta comes from the business you're in, and the unlevered beta of the business, and the debt to equity ratio you adopt. Now do you see why I tried to pull you away from regression betas? I want you to think about betas as things that will change as your debt ratio changes. So as you borrow more, I'm going to estimate your debt to equity ratio, a new levered beta, and a new cost of equity. So your cost of equity will change. As you borrow more, your cost of debt will change. For a simple reason, bankers will find you riskier, but the process we use to come up with the cost of debt actually will help us here. Remember I said if you don't have a rating for your company, you can use your interest coverage ratio to come up with a synthetic rating? As you borrow more money, what's going to happen? Your interest expenses will go up. As your interest expenses go up, your interest coverage ratio will decrease. As your interest coverage ratio decreases, guess what? I'm going to give you a lower rating, and if your rating goes lower, your default spread will get higher and your cost of debt will also go up. So as my debt ratio changes, my cost of debt will change. And there's one final test I've got to run. As I borrow more money, my interest expenses keep rising and rising. In fact, if I'm not careful, they might rise above my operating income, in which case I can't just multiply by 1 minus the tax rate. There's no tax benefit, so I've got to constantly stop and check, and that process is where the Tax Reform Act has made things more complicated. Pre-2018, what I used to do was check the interest expense against the operating income. It was less than the operating income. I said, we're home free. You get the entire tax deduction. Now, what else do I have to check? Somebody mentioned this. I have to check and make sure the interest expense is not higher than 30% of EBITDA. That's a new constraint that's been put in, because that's a second constraint, and if it exceeds it, my tax benefit goes away, which means the tax rate I apply on the cost of debt will be lower. My after-tax cost of debt is going to go up. And if I have my cost of equity and cost of debt done right, I can compute the cost of capital at every debt ratio, and I'm looking for that mix that minimizes my cost of capital. Sounds simple, right? Let's try it. Okay? Before we do that, though, I want to take a little sidelight. This entire process is built around the presumption that the cost of debt reflects what you borrow money at, and the cost of equity is what equity investors need to make to break even in the stock. I think I might have asked this question when we did this in the context of cost of equity, but let's make sure we get this nailed down. Let's suppose you run into a CFO who says, look, the cost of equity is just the dividend yield. So it's really cheap to raise money. So my cost of capital actually goes down the more equity I use. What's the problem with that? What's the flaw in that argument that the cost of equity is just the dividend yield? What are we missing? People don't buy stock just to get the dividend. If all they wanted was the coupon, they'd buy a bond. They bought your stock because they expected price appreciation. Of course, they're going to be disappointed some of the time, but at least you got to try to deliver that price appreciation, or it's not going to happen. The cost of equity will generally be higher than the cost of debt. I'm kind of hedging there, right? I didn't say I'll always be higher. This is a great interview question for you to ask somebody else once you get out there and you want to torture them. Ready? Can the cost of equity for a company ever become lower than the cost of debt? Give me the scenario. There is a circumstance, but tell me what has to happen.
When the cost of debt is basically infinite because you are
Well, I'll charge infinite plus 2, right? We're in math, no man's land anyway. So I'll give you the devil's advocate argument, which is if you're charging infinite and I'm behind you, I should charge infinite plus. Right? Because you're saying, I won't even get my cash flows. I'm definitely not getting my cash flows. Then if you're not getting your cash flows. Okay, so now we're on to something. If you're a publicly traded company, what do we say drives your cost of equity? The portion of the risk that cannot be diversified away, right? So if you're a gold mining company where the bulk of your risk is firm specific, you said your beta can be really low. It doesn't even have to be negative. And your cost of equity can be really low. Can a gold mining company have a lot of default risk? Sure. Because the gold prices go up and down. I might not care as a diversified investment. It is conceivable for companies with very low market risk, very low unlevered betas, to end up with a cost of debt higher than the cost of equity. You're saying, what do I do then? You're the CFO of this company. What should you do? Never borrow money. It's as simple as that. Use equity, because if equity is cheaper than debt, why would you ever put yourself at the risk of default risk? So can the cost of equity be lower than the cost of debt? Yes, for a very small subset of companies. But it doesn't create any conundrums for me, because I can find a way to come up with the right financing mix. For you, it should be all equity. But it's an exceptional case. In most companies, for most of your companies, your cost of equity is going to be higher than your I'm not even talking about the after-tax, than your pre-tax cost of debt. So now let me show you a table that I was shown in my first corporate finance class. 1979 fall. first semester of my MBA program, I was sitting on my first, I was going to be a corporate strategy MBA, but I was saved. So this was my first corporate finance class, and the professor came in and said, today we're going to talk about optimal debt ratio, and we're going to use XYZ widget company. Anytime people use the word widget, my antenna go up. Why, when you have 43,000 real companies, would you invent a company that makes something you've never seen? Have you ever seen a widget? What the heck is a widget? The problem is, you talk about widgets and you say, and you put a beta. I can't say that beta doesn't sound right for a widget company. I don't know, widgets are discretionary, non-discretionary. So already I'm a little, we're collectively all a little suspicious. Why is this guy making up an XYZ widget company? And then he puts up an entire table and said, the cost of capital. The right debt ratio for a company is easy. All you need to do is compute the cost of equity and the cost of debt at every debt ratio, as I have in this table, and take a weighted average and come up with the cost of capital as I have in this table, and then show you how much I can use this. I've computed the value you're going to get, and not surprisingly, the lower the cost of capital, the higher the value. So the optimal debt ratio for this company is 40% debt, because of that mix, my cost of capital is only 10.14%. He said, okay, everybody get this, let's move on. Guy in the front row puts up his hand. I was never in the front row, so I never put up my hand. So this guy was always putting up his hand. So he looks at the second column. Okay? He looks at the second column, and he says, why is your cost of equity going up? And the corporate finance the professor turns and says, well, that's easy, because if you invested the equity in a company and it gets more levered, the cost of equity will always go up. Then he gave it, but then he said, but why is it going up the way it is? Because if you look at the way it's going up, it goes up by 0.5, then 0.6, and then it looks like he basically made up the numbers, to be quite honest. He said, don't worry about it. If you get the intuition, let's move on. Same guy puts up his hand and says, why is the cost of debt going up the way it is? Because it looks very linear, 0.3. And he says, don't worry about the specifics. Get the intuition. Let's move on. Let me ask you a question. If you were given this entire table for a company and asked to come up with the optimal debt ratio for a company, would you be able to do it? All you'd have to do is look at the second last column, look for the lowest number, right? My kids, when they were 6 or 7, with a little bit of bribery, could have figured that out. The second decimal point might have been a little tricky. But if you have the entire table, optimal debt ratios would be a slam dunk, right? Just look at the second last column. We gave this guy such a hard time. He decided we were just dim. He said, let me show it to you in a different way. Now do you see what the optimal debt ratio is? It's a low point on this cost to capital graph. He completely missed the point. We didn't have an issue with what he was doing. The question we were asking is, if we were in a real company, how the heck would we come up with this table? Because think about it, how many points on this table do I have with Disney? Or you have for your company, assuming you've been keeping up with the project? What's the only point on this table I have for Disney right now? I have its current cost of capital. I have 1 point. I don't have a graph. I have a point. And there's nobody giving me a cost of equity and a cost of debt at every debt ratio. It drove me crazy in that class. And it continued to drive me crazy, because every corporate finance book I would open up, there'd be this nice U-shaped cost of capital graph for an XYZ widget company. And then you'd say, go figure it out. I said, that doesn't work for me. I want to be able to figure out the point. So I'm going to take you in with the process that I use to flesh. If I can create a table just like this one for Disney, we'd be home free, right? If I can somehow take that one cost of capital and extrapolate it, and I've laid the groundwork for that in a sense in the way I've estimated cost of equity and cost of debt. If I'd estimated cost of equity from a regression and cost of debt from an actual rating, and that's all I could do, I am stuck. But to the extent that I can estimate betas and ratings at different debt ratios, I think I have a way out. So before I get ambitious and show you the table of what will happen if things change, let me nail the 1 point down that I do know. This is actually a page you've seen before, and you will see again at least 2 other times. This is their existing debt ratio for Disney, for the entire company. It's 88% equity, 12% debt. The cost of equity comes from using a risk-free rate of 2.75%. Why? Because I'm doing everything in US dollar terms. That beta to the 4th decimal point is really my bottom-up beta for Disney based on the 5 businesses they were in. The equity risk premium comes from the, what? Not the fact that Disney is a US company, but where it does business, so the cost of equity reflects those. My cost of debt, I did use their actual rating because I did have it at their existing debt ratio, 3.75%. The marginal tax rate for Disney in 2013 was 36.1%. My cost of capital at their existing debt ratio is 7.81%. So let's frame what I'm trying to do. At their existing debt ratio, the cost of capital is 7.81%. The question I'm posing is there another debt ratio, a different debt ratio at which they could have a lower cost of capital? Because if there is, then potentially that's a better debt ratio to be in. So here's the process by which I'm going to try to do this for Disney. I have their existing cost of equity, their existing cost of debt. As the debt ratio changes, I'm going to go back to the unlevered beta, which is the beta of the business they're in, and compute the levered beta at every debt ratio. So I'm going to be able to get a cost of equity at every debt ratio. At every debt ratio, I'm now going to compute an interest expense. And as I have more debt, the interest expense will go up. And that interest expense I'm going to use in an interest coverage ratio to come up with the cost of debt at every debt ratio. To the extent that I get a tax benefit, I'm going to stop and check to make sure I'm not exceeding my constraints. I'm going to look at the after-tax cost of debt. And when I'm done, I should have a table that looks just like XYZ Widget Company for Disney. I know we're getting to the end of the class, but let's do the easy half of that equation first. Which is going to be easier to do, cost of equity, the cost of debt? Cost of equity is going to be easy. What's an unlevered beta? We know the process is very simple. Here's what I do. I go back to the bottom-up beta. And the reason you want to go to a bottom-up beta is you're building the betas for the businesses. If you're in a hurry and you can't do a bottom-up beta, remember how we got an unlevered beta from a regression beta? You can take the regression beta and unlever it using the average debt to equity ratio. You're playing games with the business mix not changing, but you have to start with the unlevered beta. The unlevered beta for Disney for its operations is 0.9239. So the first adjustment I had to make was to make sure that their interest expenses, now so again, if I nail down the specifics, right now, here's what they look like. In terms of interest expenses, they have $459 million in interest expenses. That number will increase if I borrow more money. So I have a sense of what business is there and what the unlevered beta is. I have a sense of how much operating income they have, so when I borrow money, I can know when I'm getting really close. Those key numbers are going to drive what we're going to do when we come back on Mondays. I'm going to use those to first come up with the cost of equity at every debt ratio, and then talk about the cost of debt at every debt ratio. So I will see you on Monday.
You spoke about how like those gold mining companies which have very low beta also have very low cost of equity. But when I was reading, this was like last semester when I was reading Break into Wall Street, it spoke of how companies that are trading at really high PE multiples have effectively very low cost of equity because, but that's not true. But why is it not true if I may ask? Because, I mean, theoretically it makes sense because that beta is really high.
You can't fit the price-earnings ratio and come up with the cost of equity. What if I'm a money-losing company? Doesn't have a negative cost of equity.
But like
When you invest in a money-losing company, what are you investing for? Are you investing because the money they made last year or the money expected to make this year?
but theoretically I should be concerned with
Forget about it. Let's not go there. Let's take a money-losing company. A company with very low earnings now. It's a high-growth company, and you're paying a price for the company. Why are you paying for the company? Not because of what they made last year, but because of the growth and what they expect.
Oh, so I see.
You see, the flaw
Yeah.
is if I take high growth
They're not just
companies,
expecting
the
negative.
cost of equity will, if I just look at the earnings, well, look where, but if I ask you as an equity investor, would you really settle for a 3% cost of equity in the company? You say, are you crazy? I want a 15%. Right? But you're willing to live with the 3% earnings because you think it'll grow out over time.
That makes sense.
So flipping the price earnings ratio works only for really mature companies with no growth. Because then you could argue the earnings and dividends.
Yeah. But they will not have it for that reason.
But it's a very sloppy way of doing cost of equity, and it's in fact, intuitively doesn't make sense.
Thank you.
If the companies won't be able to explore the similar type benefits system on a tax cut, we're going to be shifted incentive of investing in capex because of the
Borrow money, maybe I should say, your project analysis, your cash flows are now going to be much higher because now it's barely 25%. Don't isolate your other contract. Would you rather have 18% more cash flows every year than you used to? Because at the most, your cost of capital is going to move by 10 basis points. Your earnings cash flows are going to be up by tens of millions of dollars. So the net effect is not going to be sufficient. If I kept the cash flows the same, and you kept your debt ratio the same, then you're right, the cost of capital will go up, but that's a very static view. Because your debt ratio doesn't have to change all the time. And the manufactured projects you take will now be very different because your cash flows are going to be higher.
just to reiterate, just to see if I know that's the right concept. The beta you use for the weighted average cost of capital is the levered beta of the project, of the specific to the project. So you use the debt equity ratio of the project specific.
If the project can be funded with that project. If it's, for example, Home Depot is opening a store, I would not focus on how the individual store is funded because Home Depot funds a portfolio of stores. To the extent that a project